Guilt is one of the most powerful emotions we experience. It can keep us awake at night, push us to make amends, or hold us back from moving forward. But guilt doesn't just live in our minds. Throughout history, societies have turned it into a public performance. They've ritualized it, turned a private feeling into something structured, repeated, and often controlled. When we talk about the ritualization of guilt, we're talking about a process where personal moral discomfort gets absorbed into formal practices. These can be religious rites, social ceremonies, or cultural habits. And they don't just reflect guilt, they shape it, amplify it, and, in some cases, manufacture it. Think about confession rituals in certain traditions. On the surface, they're about cleansing the soul, but they also formalize the idea that you must regularly admit wrongdoing, even if you're not sure you've done anything wrong. In some systems, silence itself is framed as guilt. Absence of confession becomes evidence of hidden fault. The act of ritualizing guilt keeps it alive, even when the original cause has faded. From a psychological perspective, guilt evolved to help us repair relationships. If you hurt someone in a small, close-knit group, guilt motivates you to fix it so the group survives. But when that feeling gets taken out of its original context and inserted into a rigid, ongoing ritual, it stops being about repair. It becomes about compliance. This is where organized systems, especially religious ones, have historically found power. If you can convince people that they are guilty by nature, and that the only way to address that guilt is through a set of prescribed actions, you create a loop. The ritual doesn't just respond to guilt, it produces it. And the fascinating thing is, you don't even need a specific offense to sustain it. The concept of original sin or inherent impurity makes guilt a permanent feature of existence. There's no escape except to keep participating in the system that promises relief. The relief is temporary, of course, because permanent freedom from guilt would make the ritual unnecessary. In some traditions, guilt rituals are tied to public displays, fasting, wearing certain symbols, performing acts of penance in front of others. These acts can serve a social function. They show the community you're back in good standing. But they also keep the community invested in watching each other's moral behavior. Surveillance and self-surveillance become part of everyday life. From a sociological standpoint, this turns guilt into a tool for group cohesion. If everyone shares the same guilt, and everyone follows the same ritual to address it, it strengthens the feeling of belonging. The group's moral code becomes part of each person's identity. Breaking it doesn't just cause personal shame. It feels like a betrayal of who you are. This is powerful, but it comes with a cost. If guilt is ever present, it can be used to control people's thoughts and behaviors far beyond actual harm done. You can be made to feel guilty for natural feelings, for questioning authority, or for simply existing outside the norms. And because the guilt feels internal, it's easy to forget that it was planted there through cultural conditioning. Anthropologists studying ancient societies have found that many guilt rituals evolved from older purification practices. Washing hands, fasting, offering sacrifices. These started as practical or symbolic acts to deal with real dangers, like disease or conflict. Over time, they became moralized, no longer just about health or peace, but about proving worthiness in the eyes of supernatural powers. When those powers are framed as all-seeing and all-knowing, guilt becomes impossible to hide. Even private thoughts can be treated as offenses. This makes guilt a constant companion, and the ritual becomes the only relief valve. Modern psychology tells us that guilt, when chronic, can be damaging. It's linked to anxiety, depression, and low self-worth. Healthy guilt is specific and temporary. It points to a real action, prompts repair, and then fades. Ritualized guilt is different. It's ongoing, generalized, and often disconnected from actual harm. In environments where guilt is ritualized, people can become trapped in cycles of self-accusation. They may constantly search their own minds for evidence of wrongdoing. This is sometimes framed as humility, but in reality, it can erode a person's confidence and independence. You can see this even outside formal religion. Public apologies on social media can take on a ritualized form, a predictable pattern of admission, self-reproach, and symbolic gestures to regain community acceptance. The structure is strikingly similar to traditional confession rites. The difference is that now, the congregation is the online audience. The underlying psychology hasn't changed much. Guilt is expressed publicly, absolution is granted conditionally, and the cycle repeats. There's another subtle effect of ritualizing guilt. It shifts moral focus from preventing harm to performing penance. If the main goal becomes going through the ritual, less attention is paid to whether the original harm is actually repaired. In some cases, the ritual can even become a substitute for real change. Historically, people could commit harmful acts and then balance the scales with a donation, a sacrifice, or a set of prayers. The act of going through the ritual was seen as more important than addressing the real-world consequences. This isn't moral improvement, it's moral bookkeeping. In that sense, ritualized guilt can create a strange moral economy, one where wrongdoing is just another transaction, and where the system benefits from the wrongdoing continuing, because it keeps the rituals in business. The real danger here is that guilt stops being a personal moral compass and becomes a commodity, managed, measured, and mediated by institutions. Breaking out of that cycle is not easy. Because when guilt is tied to identity, rejecting the ritual can feel like rejecting yourself. That's why people who walk away from deeply guilt-based systems often describe a period of emotional turbulence. They may feel lost without the structure, even if they no longer believe in the underlying rules. What helps in those situations is reframing guilt, seeing it not as a constant debt to be paid, but as a signal, a temporary feeling that points to something specific you can change or make right. Once that's done, the guilt has done its job, and it can go. This isn't about rejecting responsibility. It's about refusing to live in a permanent state of moral debt. Because when guilt becomes a permanent state, it stops being about ethics and starts being about control. Ultimately, the ritualization of guilt is a reminder of how easily human emotions can be shaped, magnified, and redirected by the systems we live in. It shows us that what feels natural may, in fact, be carefully constructed. If we can recognize the difference between healthy guilt that drives moral growth and manufactured guilt that serves other agendas, we can reclaim the emotion for ourselves. We can keep the part of guilt that makes us better and let go of the part that keeps us trapped, because guilt, in its purest form, is a tool, and tools are meant to be used, not lived inside. One of the most overlooked aspects of ritualized guilt is how it shapes memory. When guilt becomes part of a repeated ceremony, it doesn't just address recent actions, it rewrites your relationship with your past. The ritual often requires you to recall your wrongdoings, to rehearse them, sometimes in precise language. Over time, this repetition cements those moments into your identity. This is why people from guilt-heavy systems often carry an emotional weight long after leaving. The ritual has trained the mind to catalog and revisit faults. In extreme cases, it can create what psychologists call guilt rumination, an endless mental replay of mistakes, real or imagined. Historically, some monastic orders required members to confess even their stray thoughts each day, not because those thoughts caused harm, but because acknowledging them reinforced the idea that human nature itself was corrupt. The ritual wasn't there to repair relationships, it was there to remind you of your perpetual moral deficit. And that deficit is powerful in social terms. People who believe they are inherently guilty are easier to govern. They are less likely to challenge authority because deep down, they've been taught that they are the problem. This is why the ritualization of guilt has been so durable across cultures. It's not just a spiritual tool, it's a social technology. It keeps people aligned, predictable, and dependent on the very system that generates the guilt in the first place. There's also the phenomenon of inherited guilt. In many traditions, guilt isn't limited to what you've personally done. It can be passed down from ancestors. Sins of the family, the tribe, the nation can be placed on the shoulders of people who had no part in the original act. The ritual then becomes a way to symbolically carry and cleanse that inherited stain. This might sound archaic, but versions of it still exist today. In some cultures, people feel compelled to apologize or perform symbolic acts for things done centuries ago by members of their group. This can foster awareness of history, but it can also create a constant, unresolvable burden. After all, you can't undo what happened before you were born, but you can be kept in a cycle of symbolic repayment for it. In ancient societies, this was often tied to the idea of keeping the gods happy. The guilt of the group could attract misfortune unless addressed through sacrifice or ritual purity. In modern settings, it can manifest as endless public statements, annual ceremonies, or symbolic gestures that function less to repair the original harm and more to reaffirm the group's shared identity through guilt. One of the subtler consequences of ritualized guilt is moral outsourcing. When there's a fixed process for dealing with guilt, people can unconsciously hand over their ethical responsibility to the ritual itself. Instead of asking, "What can I do to actually make this right?" the question becomes, "What's the correct procedure to cleanse myself?" The focus shifts from outcomes to obedience. This can lead to absurd situations. In certain medieval contexts, a wealthy person could commit acts of cruelty and then pay for elaborate masses or donate to a church to offset the sin. The harm wasn't undone, but the social ledger was balanced. The ritual was satisfied, even if the victims weren't. We see similar patterns today. Large organizations may respond to moral failings with carefully staged public apologies or symbolic acts, not because those acts solve the problem, but because they restore public image. The guilt is ritualized and resolved in the eyes of the audience, without addressing the underlying behavior. The real challenge is that ritualized guilt feels good, at least in the short term. The ceremony offers closure, community recognition, even a sense of relief. That emotional payoff can make people loyal to the system that delivers it. The more intense the guilt, the more powerful the relief feels when the ritual is complete. And so the cycle sustains itself. Breaking that cycle often means learning to tolerate guilt without rushing to perform a set response. It means asking whether the feeling points to something that genuinely needs repair, or whether it's been artificially triggered by a rule or belief you no longer hold. When people make that shift, guilt stops being a permanent burden and becomes what it was always meant to be, a momentary signal to adjust course. If there's one thing the ritualization of guilt shows us, it's that morality and emotion are not just personal matters. They are deeply shaped by the structures around us. Those structures can take something as human as guilt and turn it into an engine of obedience, but they don't have to. We can take back the wheel. We can recognize when guilt is helping us grow and when it's just keeping us in place. And we can choose to step out of the ritual without stepping out of responsibility, because real moral progress doesn't come from repeating the same acts over and over. It comes from facing the world directly, taking responsibility where it's needed, and letting go where it's not. And when we do that, guilt becomes lighter, not because we've ignored it, but because we've put it back in its rightful place, as a tool for living well, not a chain to live under. When we see guilt as something that must be ritualized, we risk forgetting its original purpose. It was never meant to be a lifelong companion, whispering in our ear at every step. It was meant to be a messenger, short-lived, direct, and useful. But systems that depend on keeping guilt alive have every reason to blur that line. They thrive when guilt is constant. They expand when guilt is inherited. They endure when guilt feels inseparable from identity. And once guilt becomes part of who we believe we are, it's hard to imagine life without it. The truth is, guilt that never ends stops being moral guidance and starts being a form of captivity. It doesn't push us toward better choices. It keeps us circling the same mental track. It keeps us looking backward, not forward. Breaking out of that loop is not about pretending we're perfect or excusing harm. It's about recognizing that moral growth doesn't come from endlessly replaying our faults, but from learning, repairing, and moving on. That means letting guilt complete its job. When it points to harm, fix what you can. When it's just a shadow left over from someone else's rulebook, thank it for its warning and set it down. Without the constant weight of ritualized guilt, we can approach life with more clarity. We can act from care instead of fear. And we can start to see morality not as a cycle of debt and repayment, but as an ongoing, creative act, one we shape every day. And maybe, in that shift, we discover something surprising, that the healthiest form of guilt is the one that knows when to leave.